My name is Dana Mackenzie. Today I'm going to continue with my lecture on forks. If you remember, last time I talked about forks part 1 and discussed some forks in the opening. Today's lecture is going to be forks part 2, and I'm going to talk about forks in the middle game. So in some sense, there's not a big difference between forks in the opening and forks in the middle game. But the big practical difference is that in the opening, you might be able to learn the forks by studying opening theory and by memorizing variations. But of course, in the middle game, you can't do that. You've got to find the forks on your own and perhaps also set them up on your own. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how you do that. So, on the other hand, we will see some of the same points that I made in my earlier lecture, for example, about long-distance forks being hard to spot, and also the points about having to move your opponent's pieces into position for a fork. So all of those things are things we're going to see again in these examples. I'd also like to talk today about which pieces you are the best forkers, okay, which pieces you can use to fork your opponent's pieces, and also which pieces are most vulnerable to being forked. And I may also have a few general comments about tactics, not related to forks that we'll get to as well, but going to keep the primary emphasis, of course, on the tactical motif of the fork. All right, the first 3 examples I'm going to look at are all from my own games, and they're all from the last 3 years or so. And this is no accident. Forks are a very common ingredient in chess games, and so you should be looking for them very often. In fact, I would venture to say that in most of your games, you should either play a fork or threaten a fork, or at least be thinking about a fork at some point in the game, either for yourself or your opponent. Maybe your opponent will threaten a fork, and you'll be able to spot it coming. So really, they are one of the most frequently used tactic. And so it's not at all hard to come up with examples of them, although it is a little bit harder to come up with examples where the fork was actually played, because very commonly, if I threaten the fork, my opponent is going to see that I'm threatening it and is going to keep me from doing it. So for the fork to actually happen, sometimes it takes some slightly special circumstances, as we'll see. Okay, so the first example I want to look at is a game I played with a teenage player named Eric Algenbraun in the U.S. Open about 3 or 4 years ago. And I'm going to set up the position now. Okay, so this is the position that I want to start from. It's white to move. I'm black, and Eric Algenbraun is white. And what you can see is that I have sacrificed the exchange. In other words, I've given up a rook for a knight, and I have an extra pawn for it. So it's what most chess players would consider to be about a half a pawn sacrifice on my part. So white is a little bit ahead in material, but of course the reason I sacrificed the exchange is that I wanted to open up his king, the white king, to an attack. So black is in this position. I'm threatening to play rook to b8 check, which is very strong because it would chase the king either to a1, where I could then play bishop to b2 check, or it would chase the king to c2, where I would then get a monstrous knight fork with knight to b4 check, which hits both the king and the queen. So we can already see the forking ideas start to come, and in fact this knight fork is going to be a very key ingredient in the position. Probably what white should have played in this position actually was bishop takes knight in order to get the knight off the board and take away some of that forking potential. Now the danger of that is that white might have to give up, after rook to b8 check, white may have to give up his queen for a rook and a bishop, but because white is already comfortably ahead in material, that actually turns out to be not too bad for him, and probably at least equal. So, but, white was it's always scary to give up your queen, even if you are getting a bunch of material for it. So white thought he saw a better way of defending against my threat, and he played rook to d3. All right, now this actually walks straight into a fork, but not the one that you might be expecting. So I can't play knight to b4 right away, forking his rook and his queen, because then he would go queen takes bishop. And this sets up a pin on the knight so that I cannot go knight takes rook, because he would win my queen and win the game. So it seems in this position as if he's defending against my fork. But there's another fork that he missed. Okay, and so I want you to take a look at this position and see if you can spot where that other fork is going to be. All right, so my next move was rook to b8 check, continuing with my plan of attacking his king. And now my opponent actually saw that other fork. You see, his intention in moving rook to d3 was that he was going to move his rook over to b3 in order to defend against this check. But that would allow a killing fork, queen to e4 check. This attacks both the king on b1 and also the rook on h1. And so the king, of course, has to move, and then I would win the rook with check, and now black is way ahead in material and would have an easy win in the game. So why did my opponent miss this fork? Well, as I talked about last time, I think part of the reason is psychological, that it's a long-distance fork. It's harder to see a fork of pieces on two separate wings like this. And also I think maybe one reason he missed it is that until recently, that rook on h1 was defended. And so black didn't really have a threat to win that rook. But what happened was that by moving his rook to d3, white left that rook on h1 unguarded, and that made it then much more vulnerable to being forked. This is a point I'm going to come back to over and over again in my lecture today. So let me make it for the first time here. I want to talk about what pieces are vulnerable to forks. And a piece that's particularly vulnerable to fork is any piece that's not defended, particularly when you're talking about queen forks. Because if you think about it, remember I said last time that to really be a fork, the threats, piece has to threaten two pieces at once, and they both have to be credible threats. Now the only thing that, the only reason that black's threat here is credible, the threat of queen takes rook is only credible because the rook on h1 is not defended. As long as that rook was defended, I couldn't really fork it, because if I took the rook, then I'd lose my queen. So queen forks in particular are usually only credible if you're attacking an undefended piece. So that's a fact we'll see again in some of my other examples as well. So be very careful. It's always a good idea in any position to be conscious of undefended pieces. They're often tactics based on attacking pieces like that, and they're particularly vulnerable to forking threats. Okay, now let's continue this example. Actually, I'm not done with it, because there is more to see. Okay, so I played this rook to b8 check, and my opponent at this point saw that he couldn't play rook to b3. And so now he kind of, how shall I say it? He bit the bullet and moved his king to a1. And now I played bishop to b2 check, forcing his king back to b1. And now I played bishop takes pawn with a discovered check on the king. Okay, so the rook on b8 is attacking the king on b1. So I've mentioned before, discoveries and discovered checks in particular are something I'm going to talk about in a later tactical motifs lecture. They're also really strong moves because you get to do two things at once. You get to attack the king. In this case, I'm attacking the king, and I'm also winning a pawn on d4, which I wouldn't usually be able to win. So discovered checks are a great tactical motif. And in this case, this also gives me the time I need. Notice his king can't go to c2 because I would go knight to b4 check with the family check, hitting the king and the queen and the rook. So he has to go king to c1. And now I could play knight to b4, and my other fork comes into play, the knight fork on the rook and queen. And what's cute here is that actually he played queen takes pawn, I played knight takes rook, and I have a check here, which means that I then have time to, after bishop takes knight, to rescue my bishop, which was sitting there being attacked by pawn for a while and is not anymore. So we'll stop at this point. As you can see, black is now a pawn up. So I've regained my material with a little bit of extra material. And what's even more important than that is the fact that his king is now completely exposed to the attack of my pieces. My bishop, my rook, and my queen are all going to be able to get serious threats on his king. And so, in fact, the game lasted another 10, 12 moves or so, but basically white is totally lost here. Okay, so I think the lessons to get from this example are particularly the importance of the undefended pieces in setting up a fork. Okay, so let's go on to a second example. All right, for our second example, I'm going to look at a game I played against another teenage player. This was actually probably younger than the first example, maybe 15 or 16. A guy named David Chalk, who is an expert, rapidly improving player, very impressive talent here in the Bay Area. So in this position, I'm once again black, and David Chalk is white. And again, we're going to start this game looking at with white to move. So in this move, David makes what's probably a slight mistake, although it looks very plausible. He plays rook to b2. All right, now his thinking behind this move is he wants to set up a discovered check on the b file. As we've said, discovered checks are nice tactics to know about. But what we'll see is that b2 turns out to be kind of an unlucky position for that rook. So let's carry on. All right, so on my move, I played rook on 8 to e8. Now, this is a little bit of a surprise move, and I like playing moves to surprise my opponent because that sometimes gets them psychologically sort of off their, off balance, is I guess the word I'm looking for. So the thing is, with this move, I'm actually inviting white to go ahead and play pawn takes pawn with a discovered check, because what I'm going to do then is play king to c6, and now black is threatening checkmate with rook to e1 check, followed by an exchange of rooks and a back rank checkmate on white's king. So now white has to defend against that checkmate, and there are various ways of doing it. He could go king to f1, or he could go h3, but the point is he's got to do one of those things, and then that will give me time to win back the pawn on c5 by playing king takes pawn. And then, or maybe rook takes pawn, not sure which, but one of those moves. And white has now not gotten any advantage from his discovered check, and in fact, he's gotten the disadvantage because he's broken up his pawns and left them vulnerable to attack. All right, so what we see here is sort of the unexpected move that throws the opponent on the defensive. And in fact, what David now did was an even worse mistake than his first move. What he probably should do here is something like rook to b1 in order to protect that back rank and also get his rook out of the kind of vulnerable position. Remember, I talked about undefended pieces, and that rook on b2 is an undefended piece, and we'll see the importance of that. So that's what he should have done, but instead he played what again seems like, on the surface of it, a reasonable-looking move, f3. So he's defending against the checkmate. So now after I play rook to e1 check, he can now step out with his king to f2. But now, if you couldn't see it before, now I think you can start to see why his rook is in a very unlucky position. Do you see what black's next move is? Okay. Well, it's simply rook takes rook. Now, ordinarily you wouldn't think too much of that. It's just a rook trade. Knight takes rook. But the reason that was so effective is that now white's no longer defending the d3 square, and so black moves knight to d3 check, and surprise, we have a fork on the king and the rook. All right, so in a way this is a tragicomic story, because white voluntarily moved both of his pieces into positions where I could fork him with my knight. It was sort of like, he just kind of handed it to me, but there it is, the knight fork. And in fact, so he has to go king to g3 because anything else gets checkmated. And then I played knight takes rook, he played knight takes knight, I go rook to e2, and now black is completely winning. Basically, I've won an exchange, a rook for a knight. My rook is very active and going to munch up on his queenside pawns. And so, again, the game went on for a few more moves, but the issue is no longer in doubt. Okay, so what did we learn from that example? I think one thing you saw is the theme of kind of the pieces moving into the forkable positions, and my opponent being a little bit careless about where he was putting his pieces. And when you have to worry about this is especially when you have knights on the board. An active knight, like the knight I had on f4, is something you've always got to watch out for. I talked a little bit earlier about what pieces are commonly the victims of forks. Now let's talk a little bit about what pieces often give the forks. And I'd say the knight is the forker par excellence, because the knight moves differently from all the other pieces. And that means, for example, the knight is the only piece that can fork a queen and a rook at will, because the queen and the rook don't attack the knight back. So the knight is very good at forking, both because it moves differently from the other pieces, and also I think psychologically the knight is trickier. It has a trickier move from the other pieces, and even though he might be an experienced player, I mean David Chalk, my opponent here, is an expert. Even so, sometimes it's a little easy to miss some of the things that a knight can do. So when you see a position like this with a very active knight, it's always a good matter of principle to watch out and keep track of what that knight can do, and don't allow it to get any forks. So that's why in this position it would have been better for white to play rook to b1, because then there's no fork potential. Okay, let me also talk. There are two other pieces that I'd say are particularly good forkers besides the knight. One of them is a pawn. The reason the pawn is a good forker is that the pawn is the cheapest of all the pieces. And so if you attack two pieces at once with a pawn, those are automatically credible threats. And remember, I said that to be a real fork, both of your threats have to be credible. So anytime a pawn attacks a piece, whether it's defended or not, it's a credible threat. So pawns are good forkers because they kind of really force you to pay attention. The other piece that's a good forker, we've already seen lots of examples of, is a queen. And the queen is sort of the opposite case from the pawn. The queen is a good forker because it's so powerful, because it moves in so many directions at once. The queen can go in 8 different directions. So in theory, you could fork 8 different pieces with the queen, although I've never seen that happen, but it would be kind of amusing to set up something like that. So queens are good forkers because of their strength. On the other hand, they're the opposite of the pawns in the sense that they're the most valuable piece, and so queen forks only really become credible when the queens are attacking unprotected pieces, as I've mentioned earlier. So we've learned now a little bit about what pieces are good for forking with and we've learned a little bit about what pieces are ones that are in danger of being forked. Okay. So let's go on to another example in the middle game. For our third example, I'd like to look at this game I played against a guy named Charles Sun. And once again, he's a youngish opponent, a teenager. It's sort of funny that all three of these examples involve what I would, in the most affectionate possible way, call young whippersnappers. Three young players who are both very good, and so I don't want to, by doing these examples, I don't want to imply any criticism of them. They're good young players, but there's an interesting, I'd say, characteristic that a lot of the young players often have. And so those of you who are listening to this, if you're, a kid or if you're kind of a young player, you might want to listen up here. I find that young players, especially the ones who are good, often tend to be very aggressive and sometimes a little bit careless about defending against the opponent's threats. So it's, everybody loves to attack and everybody loves to make threats. But also an important ingredient in chess is preventing your opponent from making threats as well, or anticipating your opponent's threats. So I think we've seen that a little bit in the examples already. In that first example, my opponent didn't realize he was, letting me set up the queen fork of the king and the rook. And in our second example, my young opponent didn't realize that he was walking into that knight fork. Both of them just got a little bit careless, I think. And this is another game where I have a young opponent, and I feel as if he got a little bit careless here. So in this position, I'm black again, and my opponent, Charles Sun, is white. And again, we're going to look at the position with white to move. So what's going on here, actually, if you put this into a computer, the computer thinks white is a little bit better here. Basically, he's been pushing his kingside pawns forward, and even though queens are off the board, he's still trying to get a kingside attack going, which could be somewhat dangerous. But black does have a threat in this position, so I've just moved my bishop to d4, and I'm threatening to go bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, followed by bishop takes pawn on a2, which would win a pawn. So my opponent sees this threat and has to do something to defend it. Now, probably what he should do to defend it is play king to b1. And we'll see later on why that is. It looks like a very quiet, move that doesn't do much, but the important thing that it does is get the king away from squares where it can be forked. Now, my opponent didn't see anything bad coming, and he plays what again looks like a very plausible move, but it in fact is the losing move. He plays bishop to c4. Okay, so his idea is that he's of course protecting the a pawn by basically interfering with my bishop, and he's basically expecting a trade of bishops, and then probably he'll pursue the kingside attack. And a trade of bishops actually is good for him in this position because the white squared bishop was threatening to become a bad bishop, imprisoned behind white's own pawns. And so trading it off is actually a good thing for white. Unfortunately, he missed the tactical motif here. So take a look at this position a little bit and see what you would do for black. Okay, what I did is play b5. Okay, so this attacks the bishop, as you can see. But more importantly, what it does also is threaten b4, which is a fork of the two knights. So remember I said just a little bit earlier that pawns are good forkers because when a pawn plays a fork, when a pawn attacks two pieces, you've got to pay attention. Those are credible threats. So white has to pay attention to this threat of e4, and I'm sure he must have anticipated this move. And so he plays bishop takes bishop. I go knight takes bishop. And now I've got my forking threat, b4, and I'm also threatening to win his unprotected bishop on f4. Remember what I said about unprotected pieces. They're trouble, and white's getting in trouble because of this one. But I think white probably looked forward and saw all this was going to happen, and figured he had everything perfectly well defended after knight to e2. So no more fork on the knights. The bishop is defended. So what could possibly go wrong for white? Well, here's what goes wrong. I go knight takes bishop. Okay, whoops, let me go back, actually. Knight takes bishop is what he played, but let's see what white's possibilities are. If he goes knight takes knight, which may be what he was planning to do, that walks into a fork. Bishop to e3 check, forking the king and the knight. And so now you can see a couple things. First of all, I talked before about undefended pieces. Here the knight on f4 is undefended, and that makes it an ideal target for a fork. And then the other thing is the king on c1. That's the other piece that's being attacked in the fork. And here, if only white had played king to b1, this couldn't have happened to him. There wouldn't have been any fork. It would have just been attacking the knight. And if black were only attacking the knight could just move. And, big deal. So what makes this such a good move is the bishop is attacking two pieces at once. The king moves, and then the knight dies. Okay, but that's not all. Okay, so suppose instead of playing knight takes knight, suppose white plays rook takes bishop. Well, you can probably see the fork here. It's really, really obvious. Knight takes knight check, forking the king and the rook, and black is just going to be ahead by oodles of material and have an easily won game. So that's fork number 3, but that's not all. Okay, so there's finally the possibility what white actually played, which was knight takes bishop. So again, it looks as if he's gotten out of everything, so the knight is defended, so everything's defended, and I can't do a fork with knight e2 check, because then he'd just take my knight. But I can set up that fork with a sacrifice. Okay, I can play rook takes knight. All right, that takes away the knight, and he takes back, rook takes rook, and now I can play the fork that we just saw earlier, only, this has been delayed a move or two. Okay, knight to e2 check. Once again, this forks the king and the rook. He played king to b1, and I go knight takes d4, and again, the game went on for a few moves, maybe 10, 15 moves, but black is completely won here. Black has an extra piece, and white has no compensation for the piece that he lost. Okay, so what did we learn from this example? Well, one thing we learned is sort of, again, the thing about being careful, especially when knights start rampaging. They're really good at forking things, and so you got to watch out for that. I think one thing we learned here is what chess players call prophylactic moves. Prophylaxis is preventing your opponent from doing stuff. And in this initial position, white should have done king to b1, a nice prophylactic move. And if he'd done that move, there wouldn't have been any forks. That bishop fork wouldn't have existed. The knight forks wouldn't have existed. And so, white basically has an okay game here. He's, at least equal and maybe a little bit better. So, so just again, for your younger players, try to keep in mind not only what you're doing, but also what your opponent's trying to do. So I think that's a very important lesson to learn from this example. Okay, so far we've seen 3 examples from my own games, but I didn't want to just do examples from my own games for this lecture. And there's one other thing that in these examples I found a little bit missing from all 3 examples I've just shown you, which is in all 3 of these cases, I really got the forks because my opponent did something stupid. And, well, of course, your opponents will make mistakes, and in fact, I think there may be a valuable lesson in this, which is that at the amateur level, which is where, I'm playing a lot of these games, against A and B players or experts, at the amateur level, actually, your opponents are likely to make mistakes that let you have a fork right away. or that lets you set up a fork. But especially at the master level, I think it becomes less and less likely that your opponent's just going to walk into a fork. And so I did want to emphasize also that forks can come about as a result of your good moves rather than as a result of your opponent's bad moves. So forks are a tremendously valuable and versatile tactical weapon, and very many sacrificial attacks will involve forks at some stage. And so I was casting about, trying to think of what would be a good example for this from a master game. And then one of my fellow chess lecturers solved the problem for me. We have a new lecturer named Brian Smith, who I hope you've watched some of his lectures. And his second lecture on chesslecture.com was on sacrifices, intuition, or calculation. And he showed just a marvelous game that he played against a guy named Brailovsky in 2001. And so I hope this isn't cheating to use his game again. But if you missed it the first time, this is a chance to see it, to see what you missed. And if you did actually already see his lecture, well, this is worth seeing again. So, I'm looking at it from a slightly different perspective from the one he gave in his lecture. So I think you'll still learn something from it, even if you have seen it before. So here we are looking at this game between Smith and Brailovsky. Smith is white, and it's white's move. And in his lecture, he pointed out that probably the most obvious move here would be queen takes pawn, and that undoubtedly would be a winning move for white. But he found a neat combination based on the idea of setting up a fork. Actually, several forks. I'm going to point them all out one by one. So he plays a little bit of a surprising move here, which is bishop takes knight. So, usually bishops are stronger pieces than knights, especially in a wide open position like this. So you might wonder why he's giving it away. And also, another reason why ordinarily you wouldn't think of playing that move here is that, white still has a strong attack on black's king. And normally when you're attacking, you don't want to trade pieces. You want to keep pieces on the board and keep more threats. So the only reason Brian did this was because he worked out a forced winning combination, beginning with bishop takes knight. So let's see how it goes. Of course, his opponent played king takes bishop. And then Brian played queen to g5 check. All right, now what's black going to do on this? Okay, well, the first move that comes to mind would be king takes pawn, but that walks into fork number 1, which is queen to d5 check. Okay, forking the king on e6 and the rook on a8. So that move's no good. What about king to f8? Well, that walks into fork number 2, queen to f6 check, forking the king on f1 and the rook, f8 and the rook on h8. And black can actually go to g8 defending the rook, but then he gets checkmated with queen to f7. So there's a nice little extra wrinkle in this position, which is that pawn on e6, which turns out to be pretty darn important. Okay, so that's 2 forks, but we're not done, because there's still one more move for black, which is the move that black did play in the game, king to e8. All right, now there's no obvious forks here, so in order to get the desired forks, white has to set them up by moving black's pieces around in a very clever fashion, as we're going to see. So next move, he plays queen to h5 check. His opponent plays king to d8. Pretty easy to see that e7 and f8 lose for similar reasons to those we've seen before. Actually, well, let me show you. King to e7 loses because of queen to f7 check, king to d8, and now we have fork number 3, queen to f6 check, hitting the king on d8 and f8. So that's 3 forks. Actually, also e7 check would be decisive. If for some reason white was getting tired of forks, he could win that way as well. Okay, so king e7 doesn't work, and so king f8 would also fail because of queen to f5 check, so black played king to d8. Now here, you might be tempted, if you were white, to play something like queen to a5 check, but white's not really making any progress with a move like that. You know, black would just come back to e8, and you know, what's white accomplished? So in fact, what Brian has in mind is something more clever, a quiet move, queen to d5. It's not a check, but it threatens black's rook on a8. So the rook has to go somewhere. There's nothing that can defend it. And where's it going to go? Well, if it goes to b8, then Brian could play queen takes d6 check. Fork number 4, okay, hitting the rook on b8 and the king on d8, and winning a rook. So that's no good. So black instead played rook to a7. The only other square he can move is rook to. But that walks straight into fork number 5, which is queen to d4. And this is, I got to tell you, when I saw this, let's just say my jaw dropped, okay? Because this is not a very common fork. You don't see something like that very often. A queen forking 2 rooks on opposite sides of the boards like that. So, you know, I talked before about long-distance forks, and this is a doozy of a long-distance fork, hitting both rooks. And, you know, black can move one of them, but he'll lose the other one. And so white wins a rook and has a decisive advantage in material. And it again took 20, 30 moves for Brian actually to win the game, but the outcome was never really in doubt after this. So what a gorgeous example that is. Now let's back up once again and see what made this tick. You know, why did white have this orgy of forks? Well, if we look at the original position, remember one thing I've talked about before, unguarded pieces. Those are the pieces that are vulnerable to a queen fork. And in this position, black has 2 big unguarded pieces, the rook on a8 and the rook on h8. And we saw that both of those got enmeshed in this web of forks. So that's a very important thing to keep your mind on when you're looking at middle game positions, undefended pieces. Now there's another thing I find very interesting about this example, which I could have pointed out in some previous examples too. It's the theme of moving your opponent's pieces. Now, what do I mean by that? According to the rules of chess, you're not allowed to move your opponent's pieces. You're only allowed to move your own, right? Well, that's not really true. In fact, very often you can move your opponent's pieces around by things like captures and checks and sacrifices and threats. So what we saw throughout this combination was white basically moving black's king around sort of at will. So first of all, he played bishop takes knight, which compels black's king to move to take the bishop. Then he plays queen to g5 check, which again compels the king to move. And, you know, basically every square was bad except for e8. And then in this position, there weren't any forks. Okay, but white continued to move his opponent's pieces around. What he saw was that if he moved the king to d8 and made the queen rook move, he'd be able to fork then. And so the next move, he moves his opponent's king to d8, and then on the move after that, he moves his opponent's rook, either to b8 or to a7. So every move he's making is actually moving his opponent's pieces. And so it's a wonderful example of this. I may talk about this in future lectures too, because I think it's a very important and underappreciated idea in chess, this idea of moving your opponent's pieces, beautifully illustrated by Brian Smith in this game. So I hope you've enjoyed our examples, and I will continue this series on tactical motifs in chess in a couple of weeks. I will probably be talking about X-ray attacks. For now, this is Dana Mackenzie signing off.
Grandmaster Damian Lemos here for onlinechesslessons.net. First of all, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you would like to receive more free chess videos from us, you can just click the subscribe button below. I would also highly recommend signing up for my free mail course, the 10 Grandmaster Secrets to Dominate Chess. During this exclusive course from onlinechesslessons.net, I'll share with you my own Grandmaster shortcuts to effective attacking, defending, and growth hacks to improving your chess without complicated books or memorization. So sign up by clicking the sidebar on the right, and I know you won't be disappointed. Once more, this is Damien for onlinechesslessons.net, and I'll see you in my videos. Thank you.